Keith O'Brien, Fly Girls. In 1928, fewer than a dozen women had a government-issued pilot's license, making these women true radicals. Fly Girls tells their story, of women fighting for the right to fly airplanes, winning the right to race them, and beating some of the men in the most dangerous air race of them all. These women were bullied, they were berated, some of them even had their planes sabotaged. Incredible. It was, for female pilots, an stunning upset, and one that proved that women had known something all along. They were just as good as male pilots, some of them even better. Fly Girls is a New York Times bestseller, and it was named one of the Times 100 Notable Books of 2018, which is pretty cool. Keith was born in Cincinnati and graduated from Northwestern University. He's a prolific writer. He's written 2 books and been a finalist for the PEN ESPN Awards for Literary Sports Writing, and has contributed to NPR for more than 10 years. His radio stories have appeared on NPR's All Things Considered, morning and weekend editions. He's also written for, get this, the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, USA Today, Politico, Slate, Esquire, and the Oxford American. Apparently he's got nothing else to do. He's a former writer of the Boston Globe and the New York Times Picayune. He's won multiple awards, including the Casey Medal for Meritorious Journalism. Keith and I were talking, and I really enjoyed the book. If you're into history, or if you're an aviation nerd, of which I am, it's a must-read, okay? Lastly, a little tidbit about Keith. When he was in Chicago, he says he learned to parallel park, which he considers his one and only true superpower, which is probably not a bad one to have. But he actually has other superpowers. He says making waffles for his kids, and this is my favorite, singing 1980 television theme songs by heart. So maybe if we ask him nicely, he might just belt one out for us. He lives in New Hampshire with his wife and 2 kids. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm Gaithersburg Book Festival to Keith O'Brien.
Well, I don't want to disappoint anybody, but I will not be singing here this afternoon. That's a different gig later tonight. I want to thank Nick for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank the city of Gaithersburg for this amazing event. I want to thank you all for coming out and supporting literature, supporting authors. We work alone. Alone in offices, alone in archives, alone in our doubts. And so it is just so gratifying to see people like yourself out here supporting us. So I really want to thank you on behalf of everybody. Thank you so much. So this seems like a sharing audience, a safe place. And so I thought I'd begin today with a confession of sorts. And that is, I am not a brave flyer. I don't like turbulence. I don't like the little sounds that a plane makes for seemingly inexplicable reasons. And I really don't like takeoff. You know, that moment when you're barreling down the runway, 100 miles an hour, jumping off into the air so fast you can feel the weight of the plane on your chest as you move further and further away from the ground. I actually don't like that feeling at all. I do travel for work, and I like to travel for pleasure, so not flying for me is not an option. Which means that inevitably, from time to time, you will find me in the 29th row of coach, white-knuckling the armrest like I'm the one holding up the plane. You know, a few years ago, I was on a flight like that. I was flying from Boston to Pittsburgh for a story I was doing for Politico magazine. And it was one of those flights where the pilot comes on before you even take off and says, "Folks, it's going to be a bad flight." And he was right. You know, in the middle of that flight, in the night, in a storm, here we are bouncing around in the sky. And there I was, like, trying to curl up into a tiny little ball in my seat, but resisting the urge to do that because that would be an insane thing for a grown person to do on a plane. And the woman who was sitting next to me, she totally noticed, and she finally couldn't take it anymore. She turned to me and she said, "Honey, I think I can help you. I have Xanax." True story. True story. So this is me. This is me as a flyer. And it sort of begs the question why someone like this, someone like me, would spend over 2 years researching and writing about planes at a time when plane travel was exponentially more dangerous than it is today. You know, why would I do that to myself? Why? And the answer is that it has nothing to do with planes. I was drawn to the story that became Fly Girls because it is the story of an epic quest, populated by characters who were willing to risk everything to do the thing they loved, who would face adversity after adversity, entrenched discrimination, and the deaths of their friends, and still they would keep flying, still they would keep going, only to triumph in the end, beating the men in 1936 in one of the most celebrated air races of them all. That's a story I would hope anybody would want to tell, and it's certainly one I knew I wanted to tell when I stumbled upon it just about 3 years ago. And it is a real joy to share it with you here today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my book and how it came to be, and also the latest edition, which is a young readers edition for middle school readers. And then I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Whenever I am writing a story, whether it's for books or radio or magazines or newspapers, I like to think about them in terms of scenes, in terms of moments. I identify early on the most important moments and then build around those. And so I thought I'd begin this afternoon with you with a moment. I want you to imagine September 1933, the waning days of summer, Labor Day weekend in Chicago. The city at that point had been struggling in the grip of the Great Depression for years. Record unemployment, bread lines down the street. But that weekend, Labor Day in Chicago, 1933, it was going to be different. The city was preparing for a crush of visitors, about 400,000 people, traveling in by rail car and automobile. They were coming for an exciting event. They were coming for the air races. We need to forget about what we know about our modern day air shows, our scripted, polished flying events. Air racing in the 1920s and 30s, this was a real sport with winners and losers, massive crowds, jackpots of money for the victors. I'm talking about 500,000 paying fans over the course of a single weekend, putting down $1 during the Great Depression to come into the airfield. Just as many would watch for free on the hoods of their automobiles parked on nearby highways. So it's an incredibly popular sport, and just definitively, it is the most dangerous sport of them all. Inevitably, these pilots, both the men and the women, flying open cockpit planes at a high rate of speed, low to the ground, would crash. And the pilots would often die right in front of the grandstand. So, because of these dangers, because of these risks, because of the crowds, because of the money, because of the stakes, many men believed that air racing was no place for a woman. It's absurd, right? It's sexist, it's demeaning, it's obviously wrong. But at the time, actual laws on our books forbade women from doing all sorts of things. In the late 1920s in this country, women were banned from working the night shift, from waiting tables after 10 p.m., from working in factories, from driving taxi cabs. In the late 1920s, women were banned from as many as 15 different professions. And if you were a married woman, in particular, if you were a married teacher, it was even harder for you. If you were a single female teacher, right here in Maryland, right here in this county, in the late 1920s or early 1930s, and you had the audacity to decide to get married over the course of your school year, your local superintendent or school board, almost always men, would force you to resign at the end of that year. Because it was believed by these men that a woman couldn't handle the rigors of teaching our children all day, only to go home to raise her own. So women are denied access to jobs, basic rights, and other things too. Around the time when my story begins in 1927, a theater roof collapsed not far from here in Washington, D.C. It was a real tragedy and a big national story, and in this roof collapse, a young boy died. The boy's mother wished to sue the theater company for negligence, a case she likely would have won. But laws denied her that right. Only a father Only a father could collect damages in the wrongful death of a minor child. And this boy's father was already dead, meaning the mother in question had no husband, no child, no way to fight it. Women hoping to fly planes in the late 1920s faced similar challenges. In the presidential election of 1928, there were 29 million women in this country who were eligible to vote. 29 million. Out of that number, fewer than a dozen, fewer than 12, had a pilot's license on file at the U.S. Department of Commerce, which was the regulating agency at that time. And that really did make the few women who did fly planes real renegades, real radicals, the kind that's almost hard to imagine today. In Chicago, September 1933, one of these women was about to do the most radical thing of all. She was going to race the men, whipping her plane around pylons, 50-foot towers placed on the ground in a triangular course. She was 29 years old, divorced, and afraid of nothing. Her plane that day was so fast as to be known to be dangerous. This particular model of plane, called a GB, had killed many men. But she knew what she was doing. She knew how to fly it. And as she reached the home pylon at sunset that Labor Day in Chicago, the crowd knew it too. Screaming into that pylon at over 200 miles an hour, just 60 feet off the ground. She banked her plane so hard, so perfectly around that tower that it stood up on its wing. "Just look at that girl," the announcer said. That was his words. "Just look at that girl. Have you ever seen such a beautiful race?" She was trailing the two leaders, but she was vying for third place. She was right there. And then on the 8th turn at the home pylon, a problem. The right wing of her speedy plane began to disintegrate in mid-flight. This wing, built out of spruce and linen, fell apart, and chunks of it fell to the ground like so much confetti. And with the wind now whistling through the holes in her wing, she did exactly as she was supposed to do. She peeled off course, flying away from her competitors and the crowd, people on the ground, south toward the city of Chicago, out over Glenview Road and Lake Avenue. She was struggling to gain altitude to save the people on the ground and also to save herself. Everyone now at the airfield in Chicago was watching her little red plane in the sky, knowing one of two things was about to happen. She was going to bail out from a dangerously low altitude, or she was going to crash. Either way, it probably wasn't going to end well. That woman's name was Florence Klingensmith. You probably haven't heard of her. Most people haven't. When I started this project, I certainly had never heard of her. When we think about women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s, we tend to think about one or two women. Bessie Coleman, the first African-American female pilot in this country, who dies in a plane crash in Jacksonville, Florida in 1926, about a year and a half before my story begins. Or, of course, Amelia Earhart. And when we think about Amelia, we tend to think about her flying alone, alone over the ocean, alone into an angry cultural headwind. But in the time that Amelia was flying, other women were flying with her. And they really did form this small, scrappy squadron in the sky. Each of them was brave. Each of them was bold. Some of them arguably were more talented in a cockpit than Amelia. Today, we have forgotten almost everything about them. Their battles and their losses, their friendships and their rivalries, what they fought for, how hard they fought. We've forgotten, too, their seemingly impossible victory over the men in 1936. With my book, I hope to change that and remind readers again of this time and these characters. Women who stood up for themselves and each other again and again, defiant in the face of rules that were intended to keep them in their place, and also confident in the knowledge of who they were. I want to be very clear here. This is not intended to be a comprehensive history of women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s. The sort of textbook history where each woman gets her own chapter. If you wanted to write that kind of book, you'd need 25 or 30 chapters. My story is really the story of a group of friends. Amelia Earhart and her friends who tried to change the world. And I want to introduce them to you briefly now. It's a story that begins with a woman named Ruth Elder, who in 1927 was 24 years old and already on her second marriage and living in Lakeland, Florida, where she was answering phones at a dentist office. It was not the life that Ruth Elder had imagined for herself. And so that summer, Ruth came up with a bold plan. She knew how to fly, and she decided she wanted to be the first woman to ever fly across the ocean. She was inspired, of course, by Charles Lindbergh, who makes this very flight that spring. And Ruth herself, just like Lindbergh, will become quite famous for this plan. By the end of 1927, Ruth Elder has made headlines on both continents, Europe and North America. She is one of the most famous women in the world. But for this bold plan, she will also pay a really awful personal price. Amelia Earhart is a social worker from Boston who comes next. You know, in our quest to remember Earhart or to solve how she disappeared, we seem to have forgotten everything about how she actually lived. And the fact is, in 1927 and 28, Amelia wasn't a famous pilot. She was a licensed pilot, but by her own admission, she wasn't doing much flying anymore. She was a social worker in Boston's Chinatown, teaching new immigrants to this country how to speak English. It was here that East Coast businessmen, including her future husband, George Putnam of Putnam Publishing, will discover Amelia and put her on a plane, not flown by her, but flown by men across the ocean in June 1928. On this flight, Amelia has no job but to sit behind the two men and take notes for a book that she will write if they make it, if they live. Of course they do. When her plane lands safely in the water off the coast of England, Amelia has now become one of the most famous women in the world. But to her enduring credit, she knows that what she has done on this flight is really nothing. As she will say that summer, I was just a sack of potatoes on that plane. I was cargo. And she will spend the rest of what will be a very short life, just 9 years in the spotlight, making bold flights in an answer to her critics. You know, it would surprise us to know, but it is true, even Amelia Earhart had critics. Ruth Nichols was a daughter of Wall Street wealth, born on the Upper East Side of New York. You know, until the stock market crash of 1929, Ruth Nichols and her family had money, but she desperately wanted everything that Amelia had. And more than any other woman, it is Ruth Nichols who will push Amelia and really challenge her for the title of most accomplished female aviator in this country. Indeed, by 1931, Ruth Nichols has eclipsed Amelia, and Amelia knows it. By that spring, Ruth Nichols has the speed record, the altitude record, the transcontinental speed record. Ruth Nichols flies her plane across this country faster, not only than Amelia, but even than Charles Lindbergh. And it is Ruth Nichols, not Amelia Earhart, who sets off first, all alone in the cockpit of a plane, trying to go over the ocean in June 1931. This is 1 year before Amelia would ever attempt such a flight. And were it not for happenstance and bad luck, the sort of bad luck that dogged flyers in these days, Ruth Nichols may have gotten there first. And had she, it would have changed everything we know about the history of women in aviation in this country. Indeed, I think it would change much of what we know about the history of feminism in this country. Florence Klingensmith, who I mentioned before, was a daughter of a farmer in rural Minnesota. Just like Ruth Elder in 1927, Florence was not happy with her life. She wasn't doing anything adventurous. She was working at a dry cleaner's in Fargo, ironing shirts. What she really wanted to do was fly planes. But probably like a lot of us, she had no path to that kind of dream. Her family had no money, no connections. So she does the only thing she can do, Florence does. She enrolls in mechanic school in what is now modern-day Hector Field, the airport in Fargo. One woman out of 400 men learning to build airplane engines. It is here where Florence begins to press her case to connected business people in Fargo, trying to get them to help her buy a plane. And finally, they do. And Florence is quickly flying that plane into the record books. Her specific skill was the air races. Whipping your plane around towers placed on the ground, like NASCAR in the sky. It is because of her skill and ability in that particular endeavor that the men invite her to race against them in September 1933, in a race that will really change everything both for the women in the air and on the ground. And then finally, there's Louise Thaden. Louise, to me, is the scarcest kind of aviator in these days. She was not just a woman who flew and raced planes. Louise was a mother. Louise has her first child in 1930, her second in 1933. At a time when our culture, and indeed many husbands, expected wives to stay home and raise children, Louise does a very modern sort of thing. Something that many working parents, both fathers and mothers, do today. She tried to have it all, juggling her career goals and personal ambitions, which of course she had, with her responsibilities at home and her love for her children, which of course she had. And it really is only because of the sacrifices that Louise made in this little window of time that we have wrongly forgotten her and erased her from this story. So now that I've introduced you to them individually, I just want to say a few things about them collectively, and then I'll be happy to take any questions you all might have. I want to talk to you a little bit about what they overcame, who they were, and why they still matter today, because they do. We simply cannot overstate just how dominated aviation was by men, in particular white men, in the 1920s and 30s. Planes were built by men for men. The cockpits of these planes were often too big for most women. Many of my characters would have to modify them with pillows and padding just so they could reach the controls or the pedals. And when these women, Amelia and Ruth Nichols and Louise Thaden, flew across this country, as they all did, and stopped to refuel in Wichita or Kansas City, they would often have no place to go to the restroom, because airfields in these days only had one kind of restroom. It was a men's room. So the odds are against them, the laws are against them, the men are against them. More than once, they will banish the women from air racing. And because of this, these women knew they had to stick together. They could battle one another in the sky for prize money and trophies. They could want that history for themselves. Indeed, they did. Ruth Nichols and Amelia Earhart kept secrets from one another about their plans to fly solo across the ocean. They each wanted to get there first. They knew that the woman who did that would earn the key to the room of immortality. But on the ground, they did stick together, and they really would become good friends. Because who could understand Louise Thaden better than Ruth Nichols? Or who could understand Amelia Earhart better than Florence Klingensmith? Can you imagine being Louise Thaden at the preschool in 1934 and talking to fellow mothers about what you do for a living? It would have been almost impossible for her to find people who understood that. And they really did become quite close. And I did find evidence of that in my research. In 1932, Amelia will fly solo across the ocean. And then 35, she'll add the match set to that record. She's going to fly nonstop from Honolulu to Oakland. So she'll have the Atlantic and the Pacific. And this is a flight many of you have probably made. It's a flight we make every day. But at that time, it was very dangerous. Aviation officials gave Amelia a 50-50 chance of making it in a single-engine propeller plane. Of course, she makes it. 10,000 people have waited all night in Oakland to see her land. And when she does, she receives accolades from around the world, but not from her friend Louise Thaden. That week, Louise writes her a letter. And Louise was from Arkansas and had a very specific way of speaking, a sort of a plain-spoken charm about her. And she said to Amelia, and I'm quoting here, she said, "Darn your hide, I could spank your pants. Someday you have to tell me why you do things like this." And in this letter to her friend, Louise tells Amelia that she wishes she would rest on her laurels, and then specifically tells Amelia, "You are worth more alive than dead." This is 2.5 years, of course, before Amelia will go missing in another very dangerous ocean flight. So they overcome much. They are close friends. And really, in my opinion, they will change the world. You know, every pilot who comes after them, every female pilot who comes after them really does stand on their shoulders. You know, many of you have probably heard of the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, you know, who come in the 1940s. If these women here had quit as the men wanted them to do, or accepted their banishment, or accepted the rules against them, very likely the WASPs never come to be. And you know, female pilots today, you know, do still cherish these women as heroes. But there is still a battle to fight now. You know, today in this country, just 7% of pilots are women. And when you go to airlines, that number drops even further. Some airlines have as few as 3.5% women in the cockpit. Now, we could have a long conversation about why that is, and it is changing. But one reason, certainly, for that deficiency is the long-entrenched discrimination that women faced in aviation, not just in the 1920s and 30s, but for the better part of the 20th century. You know, in the time when my story happens, the first woman does get hired as an airline pilot. Her name was Helen Ritchie. She was from McKeesport, Pennsylvania. And she got hired at a place called Central Air. And it did not go well for Helen. Within 10 months, she was forced out. The all-male pilots union at Central Air would not admit Helen. And since she was not a union member, by rules, she could not fly. So she's given a job because she's good at doing a job, and then told she can't do the job. And in 10 months, she's out. And you know, as a journalist, you have to be curious about the world. You're always asking questions. And one question I had when I learned about Helen Ritchie was, well, when was the next woman hired? And I was stunned to learn that it would be 39 more years, 1973, until the next female pilot was hired at an airline. That year, American Airlines hired a woman. She was 24. She was from Florida, the daughter of a pilot. She had been struggling for years to get hired by any airline. Some airlines still in existence today rejected her and told her, "Don't bother applying again. We don't hire women." You know, but she persisted. And that summer, American Airlines hires her, and the president of American Airlines pins her wings on the lapel of her jacket in a ceremony that all the press attends. And yet still, through the 1970s and 80s and 90s, this woman faces much adversity. Snide remarks from colleagues, insulting remarks from passengers, and perhaps most shocking to me as a journalist, insulting remarks from the press, the same press that dogged my characters in the 1920s and 30s. You know, at that ceremony I mentioned, where American Airlines pinned the wings on the lapel of her jacket, American Airlines invited all the national media. They made a big deal out of it, as they should have. And that weekend, the Los Angeles Times, one of our most prestigious papers, both then and now, ran a little feature story about this woman, and it ran under a very unfortunate headline. The headline was, "Airline pilot to fly by seat of her panties." 1973. You know, it's a headline that's memorable for all the wrong reasons. And you know who remembers it the most? The pilot herself. She flew for American Airlines for more than 20 years until she rose up the ranks of seniority. And she was flying those ocean flights, New York to Paris, New York to the Caribbean. Her name is Bonnie Taberzi Caputo. She's still alive today, lives in New York City. She's retired, a mother and a grandmother now. And I've had the great pleasure of meeting her in the past year and many other pilots. And were Bonnie with us today, she would believe we have a responsibility now. Now that we know this story, and I certainly feel that too. And I especially feel we have a responsibility to remember these women. Not just one woman, but the whole lot of them. And that is why I'm really so excited, not only about the success of this book here, but about the Young Readers Edition, which Politics and Prose also has today. Again, Houghton Mifflin and I adapted that for kids ages 8 to 12, depending on your reading level. It's a great middle school book. And when I talk to people about it, people often ask me, well, what do you hope young girls take away from it? And my first answer to that is, well, I hope it's not just girls reading it. And I say that as a father of boys. My boys need to know that a woman can be just as strong, just as tough, just as brave as they are. But I do think there's a special value in this book for a 10-year-old or 11-year-old or 12-year-old girl. I think when you realize that Amelia wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime woman, but part of this squadron of women, it makes her heroism more accessible, to a young girl. And, I'm pleased to say that it's at least happening in pockets. Just this week, and I'll close with this. Just this week, I was contacted by a family in Wellesley, Massachusetts, which is about an hour and a half from my home in New Hampshire. And they told me that their sixth grade daughter was doing a wax museum project at school where they had to be a famous person and do a report about him or her. And the school had offered her Amelia Earhart, but she had read my book. And she said, no, I want to be Ruth Nichols. So they reached out to me to say, do you have any research documents you could share with us? Because she needs 3 sources for her report, and all we have is your book. So I sent them some scanned documents, and then just as luck would happen, I was going to be in Wellesley on the day of her wax museum. So I stopped by, and she was made of wax, so she couldn't actually hand me this note, but her mother did, and I wanted to share it with you. She said, "Dear Mr. O'Brien, thank you so much for the sources and Fly Girls. I'm so excited for the wax museum, and I hope that my classmates will learn about Ruth Nichols. I'm very thankful that you've told me about Ruth, and having all her letters helped me with writing about her. Thank you so much, Sarah." And I want to thank you, too, for coming out today. Thank you for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions y'all might have.
That was very inspiring, and I had gone to
Thank
see
you.
Come From Away. Did you interview the pilot that flew to Newfoundland during 9/11?
I did not. So, like I said, even that story about Bonnie Taberzi Caputo, which I just shared with you, it's not part of the book. My story really does strictly focus on this group of friends. And so, unfortunately, they are all gone. They've all been dead for at least 40 years, some for twice that, 80 years. But I will say this, just because it has a little bit of relevance right here in Maryland. The first thing I did when I hit upon this idea was I did try to track down descendants, right? Many of these women did not get married. Almost none of them had children. But Louise Thaden did, like I said. And so the first thing I did was, look up her 2 children. And, I searched for her son first. His name was William Thaden. And as a reporter, by the way, we love people with unusual last names. Much easier to find. So I look up William Thaden, and I was devastated to learn that not only had he died just a few years earlier, but he lived 20 minutes from me in New Hampshire. And how you just sounded was how I sounded when I learned that too. And when I'm very early in a project like this, I take everything as like a sign from the gods. And this was like a horrible sign that I had been right here and he was right there, and I just didn't know about this story. But then I looked up her daughter. Her name was Patricia Thaden. Her mother called her Patsy. She was born in 1933. So when I started this 3 years ago, she would have been 82 years old. And I was thrilled to learn that she was alive, and she lives right here in Maryland, in Leonardtown, Maryland, down the peninsula there. And I've spent a great many afternoons in Pat's house, she can't recount for me dialogue in the kitchen between Amelia and her mother. She's 3 when my story ends. But when you sit with someone's child or parents or spouse that you're writing about, you do learn about them in ways you can't even from the most detailed diaries. And so Pat and the Thaden family are very special to me.
It made me think also about the women that maybe navigate the oceans. Are there any, I wonder if there are stories about women who do that. I don't know.
The thing that I learned doing this project is there are stories about so many people we've forgotten. People often on the margins of society. People who were marginalized in those decades. Minorities, African Americans, Latinos, women, people of religious minorities as well. Absolutely.
Can you tell us what happened to Klingensmith over Lake Michigan?
The question is, can I tell you what happened to Klingensmith? I can't tell you that. It ruined the story. Come on.
Hi, Keith. My name is Nick. I introduced you about an hour ago. I don't know if you remember that.
Hi, Nick.
Okay. Again, I really enjoyed the book. You brought up another pilot you touched upon earlier, Bessie Coleman, and being an African-American woman. It's my understanding that she learned to fly in France because she was not allowed to fly here. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit as well. I mean, she faced a lot of discrimination being African-American.
She did. So, Bessie Coleman does learn to fly in France. She faces a great amount of discrimination. She had, of course, the hardest double whammy of that era. Not only is she a woman, she's African-American. And it is, what's stunning, like I said, she dies in 1926. And the air race era, the modern air race era, really begins in 1928. And so she just misses this moment. And what's fascinating to think about is in 1926, Bessie Coleman is famous and really famous, particularly among African Americans, but even in the white press too. There's in 1926, you won't find a story about Amelia Earhart. You won't find a story about Louise Thaden. But Bessie Coleman was extremely famous. And one thing I just couldn't help but think about as a historian who did this particular book is where may have she gone had she not died in 26, because like I said, she just misses this moment where aviation suddenly explodes and now is a thing that they actually described as air fever. Everybody wanted in.
Excuse me, thanks. So I'm fascinated by Amelia Earhart, and I just wanted to know, in your research, do you have any theories about what happened to her on her last flight? I've seen movies and read a couple books, but it's still a big question out there.
So the question is about Amelia Earhart and her disappearance, and do I have any theories about what may have happened to her? So I'll say this. My book really focuses on 1927 and 1936. She goes missing in 37. So for me here, it is addressed in what is essentially the epilogue, but it wasn't the purpose of my book. That said, you can't spend 2 years working on this project and not want to know a little bit more yourself, right? And so I did go down that rabbit hole for a while. And what's fascinating is, every 6 months, and I mean this, every 6 months, another internet sensation story pops up and says, we figured it out. And I can tell you I know it's every 6 months because every 6 months I get emails from everybody I know saying they found her. And I just want to say that the stories you've read in the past 3 years purporting to be new aren't really that new. The theory that she was captured and killed by the Japanese, this theory begins in 1942. I wonder why. So that's a theory that's as old as the ages and I think rooted in xenophobia and racism. But the other theories, that perhaps she found an island and maybe landed there and maybe died there. They never found her. That was also well known at that time. And in fact, that search happened for more than 2 weeks. And they weren't searching the water anymore because she would have been dead if she were on the water. They were searching those coral reefs and islands. Did she find one and perhaps was not found there? Is that plausible? Sure, it is plausible. But remember that Amelia had the same maps that the Navy did. And they spared no expense in searching for her. In fact, that naval search was the greatest of its time, the largest water search ever taken upon. So, that has led historians over the years to believe that, of course, the most likely thing is the thing that we don't want to think about, is that she missed Howland Island, could not find anything else, hit the water, and went down. I will say that, planes went missing over the ocean all the time in the 1920s and 30s. And when this happened, by the way, no one spun grand theories about what may have happened to the aviators. Everybody knew they were gone. It was lost. It was hopeless. But I will end by saying this to that question. Every summer when people have funding, they're still out there searching. And we will likely never find her bones or her actual remains, but those engine blocks, 2 metal engine blocks of that Lockheed Electra are sitting out there in the water, or perhaps very close to shore. And someday, with the right search and the right amount of funding, they may find them. Other questions? Over here? Over here, somebody over here.
Are you working on a book right now? And what's the topic?
So I have a couple different projects in the works right now. I always like to have 1 or 2 projects sort of working down different tracks, if you will, to see which one leaves the station. I'm very superstitious about these things. I mentioned, signs from the gods. Even when I'm with close friends, I often don't like to talk about what I'm working on until I've actually sold the proposal. So I'm going to be a little evasive here, but I've got a couple different projects in the works at the moment. Sorry, I can't give a more satisfying answer. Trust me, I'm most disappointed that I can't give a more satisfying answer. Nonfiction? Nonfiction, yes.
I was wondering, have you ever heard of the play Chamber Music by Arthur Kopit, or Coppet? I'm not sure how he pronounces his name.
I have not, no.
Okay, he's the author who wrote Oh Dad, Poor Dad, Mama's Hung Me in the Closet and I'm Feeling So Sad. He wrote a play called Chamber Music. And one of the characters in there is a woman who believes that she is Amelia Earhart. And all the women in the play, what it turns out is a bunch of people who are in a loony bin. One is convinced she's Joan of Arc, another one is Mrs. Mozart, and so on and so forth. But I played Amelia.
You did? Oh, that's
and
awesome.
I really identified with her. And I believe that out of all the characters in that play, that she really was Amelia Earhart.
That's fascinating. What's interesting about, pretending to be Amelia Earhart, it reminds me of a story. I mentioned these wild theories that aren't so new. About 40 years ago, 50 years ago rather, 1972 or 3, I believe it was, a pair of authors who were fairly established, one was an old Navy guy, wrote a book it was titled Amelia Earhart Lives. And the whole premise of the book was that Amelia Earhart had been captured by the Japanese, held as prisoner, and then re-entered back into American society secretly after the war by some negotiation between Japan and the United States, and that she was right here among us. Her name is Irene Bolam, and she's right here in Jamesburg, New Jersey. And Irene Bolam was a real person. And she had to hold a press conference in New York City presenting her documents saying, I am not Amelia Earhart. I mean, that is the level of speculation that people have gone into over the years about it. It's just, it is really fascinating. But, I think the thing we have to appreciate is she was so famous at that time. And it would be today as if Oprah Winfrey went missing. and we never knew what happened. It would consume us. Yes.
How did they finance themselves during the 20s and 30s on these races?
Yeah, the question is how they financed themselves. Of course, it was difficult, right? The Depression was hard on air racing. It was hard on aviation. Typically, these pilots, especially the women, didn't have their own plane or couldn't afford to buy their own plane. They would get sponsors. Sometimes it was the manufacturer themselves would give the plane, just like a NASCAR race driver might get his Chevrolet from Chevy. So that was one way. Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra, with which she will fly around the world and go missing, was purchased in part by Purdue University, where she was working at the time. The Purdue University Foundation bought that plane. That plane cost about $80,000. In 1937, 36, that would have been like almost $750,000. So they couldn't afford to buy them themselves.
During World War II, there was a lot of female, the WASPs. Did that ever change any of the attitudes for women in aviation after World War II when they were ferreting aircraft?
The question is, during World War II, there was a lot of female pilots who flew as the WASPs. Did that change impressions of the women? So there were about 1,000, just over 1,000 women who were part of the WASPs. Again, the Women's Air Service pilots. They flew, they did not fly in combat. They flew those planes from the factories to the bases so that male pilots didn't have to do that job and they could fly in combat. It's interesting that, meanwhile, in Russia, their women were flying in combat, both fighter planes and bomber planes. But we did not allow that. So unfortunately, the most direct answer to your question is no. It did not change impressions. And in fact, the WASPs have fought for decades for recognition, fought for the right to be recognized as veterans, fought for the right to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And I think the most stark example of how it didn't change things is that female pilots after World War II could not get jobs not only as airline pilots, they couldn't even get jobs as transport plane pilots for FedEx or the Air Service or anybody. It wasn't until, again, the 1970s where lawsuits were filed by women wishing to be hired by freight planes that changed. So, I just want to say in closing, thank you so much again for coming today. I'll be signing over at, I think, Group A, I believe. The adult version and the young reader version are for sale in there. And just thank you again so much for supporting authors, for supporting literature. Thank you to Gaithersburg, and thank you all for coming today. It was such a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.